The Dust Bowl was one of the greatest ecological disasters in American history. It devastated farms and livelihoods throughout the Great Plains. We follow the story of fictional Oklahoman farmers Henry and Josephine Martin as they navigate struggles through the Dust Bowl storms in the 1930s. Like many settlers lured to the plains by propaganda promising fertile land, the Martins built a life there just as it turned to desert in the infamous Dirty 30s. Now a colossal dust storm brews on their doorstep, threatening to engulf their homestead. For settlers like the Martins, these devastating black blizzards were a terrifying new reality. During the 1930s, the people of the Great Plains endured a crushing disaster known as the Dust Bowl. Ferocious dust storms destroyed crops and livelihoods, but media and government propaganda exploited these suffering settlers, using them as pawns to paint an optimistic picture. Reporters descended on struggling frontier towns to capture images of stoic farmers persevering in the face of drought and dust. These photos were published in big city papers with tales of courage and determination of those who lived in the plains. Propaganda posters portrayed the Dust Bowl as a misfortune, one that strong-willed settlers could outlast through good old-fashioned grit. But the reality was much more dire.
We've lost everything. How can we keep going with no crops, no grazing land, nothing but dust and debt?
Despite the propaganda, many farm families faced utter ruin. Their agricultural know-how was no match for the unprecedented environmental catastrophe.
My word, that dust storm looks like the wrath of God heading straight for us. And with the baby due any day. I know Josephine. Let's just hope this one passes quickly like the rest.
For Henry and Josephine, like so many plain settlers in the 1930s, their livelihoods were being destroyed by the unrelenting dust storms of the disaster known as the Dust Bowl. Unable to rely on government relief, the plains folk displayed their trademark ingenuity, fashioning homemade dust masks from rags, pillowcases, and corn husks. By 1940, years of crop failures, starvation, and suffocating dust had pushed over 2.5 million people off of the plains. These refugees wandered westward seeking jobs, shelter, and a place to start anew.
Curse this infernal dust. My crops are buried 6 feet under. The farm's drowning in dirt and there ain't a thing I can do about it.
Farmers like Henry Martin watched helplessly as their wheat crops died and topsoil blew away, despite following the advice from agricultural experts. At community meetings, farmers debated how to survive the unfolding disaster. The propaganda had provided no contingency for the enormity of the drought, yet eventually even these resourceful settlers reached a breaking point. Over 2.5 million fled the Dust Bowl region, becoming displaced refugees from a land they once called home. One by one, Henry's neighbors gave up, yet he was determined to see the land that he loved thrive. As the crisis escalated, artists and activists called out the propaganda for papering over the enormous scope of the unfolding disaster. Demands grew for government accountability. In response, the Roosevelt administration took the unprecedented action to aid Dust Bowl migrants and enact reforms to heal the damaged land. This pivotal chapter revealed propaganda's power to distort reality, but also the ability of truth and compassion to overcome deception and indifference.
In the 1930s, the environmental disaster known as the Dust Bowl conjured up lots of propaganda from the media. This propaganda had devastating consequences for those who lived through it. When Florence Owens Thompson and her family were photographed by Dorothy Lange in 1936, they were destitute refugees fleeing the storms and drought. But the newspaper printed that image with romanticized tales of courage and determination, ignoring the Thompsons' plight.
That kind of exploitation started even before the Dust Bowl, as propagandists and land developers lured settlers with false promises. Their rosy portrayals glossed over the region's marginal climate and vulnerability to drought.
As entire communities were buried under the mortar-like dust, the propaganda still portrayed heroic families weathering the storm through old-fashioned gumption. This spin blurred reality for those outside the disaster zone.
Pioneers who were forced out of their homesteads, the propaganda was salt in their wounds. First by luring them under false pretenses, then by romanticizing their agony as perseverance, they became refugees far from their promised land.
The spread of propaganda surrounding the Dust Bowl catastrophe becomes a turning point in history when we consider how it holds essential lessons for how we portray people enduring disasters. Lessons about truth versus deception and exploitation versus humanity.